To Edward, Elena was just another help, an inconvenient reminder of his privilege, the black girl he considered a pity hire. She would never mean anything to him or his family. But when his son falls in love with her and Edward's life suddenly needs saving, Elena must choose. Will she walk away in vengeance, leaving him to face his fate, or will she risk it all to save him? Greenwich, Connecticut. The Langston mansion sat high above the rest of the city like it knew it didn't belong. All sharp lines, pristine stone, and mirrored windows that reflected nothing but money. Inside, everything gleamed, oak floors without a single scuff, a grand chandelier that dangled above the foyer like a crystal guillotine, and a silence so thick it dared anyone to speak out of turn. Elena sat quietly in the waiting room, clutching the folder, holding her resume like it was her only shield. She was dressed professionally, blouse neatly pressed, skirt tailored, shoes polished. Her back was straight, and her eyes were alert. But nothing about her screamed pedigree. And this house could smell that from a mile away. After an eternity of waiting, footsteps approached, measured, heavy. Then he entered. Edward Langston. The name carried weight, and so did the man. Tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in a slate-gray suit that fit like it was sewn onto him. His wristwatch caught the light, sleek and expensive, a quiet reminder that his time was worth more than most people's yearly salary. He stopped in the doorway, eyes cutting sharply across the room until they landed on Elena. No smile, no greeting, just a slow scan from her shoes to her face. "You're the agency's idea of a child companion?" he said flatly, as if the words offended him. His tone was dry, clipped. He didn't sit, didn't offer a hand. He was already calculating how fast he could send her back where she came from. He turned to leave, already done with her. Then he saw Caleb, perched comfortably on the armrest beside her. The boy giggled, fingers twisting a lock of Elena's hair while she softly whispered something to him. He was smiling, genuinely, eyes lit up in a way Edward hadn't seen since the divorce. The sight stopped him. That smile, he hadn't seen it in nearly 2 years. Not since his ex-wife slammed the door and took the warmth with her. His jaw tightened. Caleb never smiled at the other nannies, never even looked them in the eye. And yet here he was, laughing like a different child entirely. Elena glanced up and met Edward's eyes. Calm, poised, not intimidated and not flustered. That irritated him more than it impressed him. Edward adjusted his cuff, gaze cold and clipped. "Fine," he muttered. "You're hired. Don't waste the opportunity." Then he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the hall, not waiting to see if she'd follow. Elena's first day. The mansion looked the same, too clean, too quiet, like wealth had vacuumed the soul out of it. She arrived at 7 a.m. sharp. The head maid, Ruth, greeted her with a tight nod and a clipboard. "You'll find Master Caleb in the sunroom. Mr. Langston doesn't like delays." Sunlight poured through tall windows, and Caleb was already there. His crayons were scattered across the floor, one hand waving as he saw her. Elena smiled. As she leaned forward to pick the boy up, she felt a figure standing behind her. She turned to meet Edward Langston's piercing eyes. "You're late," he said. She glanced at the clock. It was 7:01. "Won't happen again," she replied calmly. He stared at her brown skin, natural hair tied into a bun, and modest clothes. No smile, no welcome, just that long, silent judgment. "I hope this isn't going to be a charity project," he muttered under his breath. "You are only here because of Caleb," he added as he walked past. Elena froze for half a second. She knew what that meant. He didn't see her as qualified or deserving of the job. Yet again, like it has always happened throughout her life, opportunities are missed, and even the ones granted are with pity. Like others, Edward Langston saw her as a favor, as less than himself. To him, she was a pitiable hire of favor. But she smiled, crouched next to Caleb, and said loud enough for Edward to hear, "I never take charity, Mr. Langston. I earn everything." Edward paused mid-step, then kept walking. Later that afternoon, the air was thick with citrus-scented polish and quiet tension. Outside, the sun glared over the manicured hedges like it had no intention of softening. Inside, the Langston mansion remained ice-cold, climate-controlled, and emotionally drained. Elena stood in the hallway by the library, sorting through Caleb's drawings, a soft hum in her throat. The boy had finally settled into a quiet rhythm with her. He even drew her holding his hand beneath a crooked sun. She smiled down at the paper. Then she heard Edward's voice slice the air, calling her name. She turned. Edward Langston stood a few feet away, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in hand, untouched. He wore a tailored navy suit, not a wrinkle in sight. His tie was gone now, but he still looked like a man who hadn't smiled in years by choice. "I've just spoken to Ruth," he said. "She tells me Caleb's schedule was adjusted today." Elena's posture straightened. He seemed overstimulated. "I thought it would. I don't recall asking what you thought," Edward interrupted, taking a step closer. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. "I hired you to follow instructions," he continued. "Not to rewrite the structure of a child you've known for barely 24 hours. His eyes moved over her. Not curious, not kind, just measuring, like weighing a risk that had already disappointed him. "You people always think you know better," he muttered. Elena didn't speak, didn't move. She simply stood there, the drawings pressed to her chest. He watched her a second longer, waiting maybe for pushback, for a mistake, but she gave him nothing. He took a sip, grimaced, and walked away, leaving behind the chill of a man and used a silence, and a hallway that somehow felt colder than before. As his footsteps faded into the hallway, the study door creaked open behind Elena. She heard, but didn't turn. She just gathered Caleb's drawings and began stacking them neatly. Her hands moved slowly, carefully, though her shoulders were still tense from Edward's earlier words. Then, she heard an unfamiliar voice that broke the silence. He sounded like Edward's, but a younger, softer version. "You stood your ground." She turned this time. A young man leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. He looked like he was in his early 20s. Tall, with the same piercing eyes as Edward, but warmer, less sharp. His tie was loose, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. He was put together effortlessly in a way that said he didn't have to try too hard, and he knew it. "I'm Marcus," he said, Edward's firstborn disappointment. She blinked, and a smile broke out on her lips. He pushed off the doorframe and strolled in, hands in his pockets. "Ruth told me there was someone new. I figured I'd say hello before the place freezes over completely." Elena gave a polite nod and introduced herself as the new nanny. Marcus smiled and said, "Well, if you're still here after Dad's morning routine, you're tougher than most." She said nothing. He walked past her, pausing at the door to the sunroom where Caleb sat, now quietly coloring. "He seems to like you," Marcus said, softer this time. "That's rare." Elena looked at him, searching for sarcasm. There was none. Marcus glanced back at her. "If you ever need to breathe, the East Garden doesn't have cameras. Just roses and bad cell service." Then he left, whistling something under his breath. He disappeared around the corner, footsteps light. Elena stood frozen for a moment, heart thudding in her ears. Not because of fear, but because Marcus Langston had just looked at her like she wasn't invisible. It's been 2 weeks since she started working with the Langstons. Every day, she looked forward to seeing Marcus. He and Caleb were the only reason she wanted to keep coming. Not even Ruth treated her right, always cold and judgmental. But Marcus was a breath of fresh air, slowly growing on her. "Bring Caleb to dinner." Ruth's voice interrupted her thoughts. Dinner at the Langston estate was never warm. Though long enough to seat 20, the table usually hosted just 3. Edward at the head, Marcus on one side, and Caleb, when he could sit still long enough, on the other. Tonight, Caleb sat between them, fidgeting with his spoon. Elena stood at the sideboard, silently refilling water glasses and watching for cues from Ruth. She hadn't expected to be in the dining room tonight, but Ruth had insisted it was good for Caleb's structure. Edward, fork in hand, glanced up just as Marcus leaned sideways to whisper something to Caleb. The boy giggled a real one, not forced. Elena smiled without thinking, catching Marcus's eye. He smiled back. Although it lasted maybe a second, Edward saw it. His knife paused mid-cut. His eyes snapped to Marcus, then to Elena, then back to Marcus. "That's enough chatter," Edward said coolly. "Caleb eats in silence. You know that." Marcus leaned back, jaw tightening just slightly. "He's 6, not a monk." Edward didn't reply. He just returned to his plate, his eyes unreadable but unblinking. Later, when dinner was done and the dishes cleared, Elena passed Edward in the hallway. He didn't stop walking, but he said, without turning his head, "You'd be wise to remember your place in this house, Miss Ramirez." Elena didn't respond. But as she rounded the corner to check on Caleb, she knew exactly what that meant. Edward had seen it, and he didn't like it. The Langston house. Later, late into the night. It was quiet upstairs. Most of the staff had retired for the night, and the vast mansion felt like it was holding its breath. Elena stood in the hallway near Caleb's room, checking on him one last time. He'd fallen asleep with his hand curled around a stuffed dinosaur, his breathing soft and even. She closed the door gently and turned. Marcus was leaning against the wall, arms folded, watching her. His tie was loose, his sleeves rolled up, and his sharp, thoughtful eyes were softer than she'd ever seen them. "You have a calming effect on him," he said quietly. Elena offered a small smile. "He's a sweet kid, just needs patience." Marcus stepped closer. "And what about you?" he asked. "Do you need patience too?" The question lingered in the air longer than it should have. Elena looked down, half smiling. "I need a lot of things," she said. There was a pause. Then Marcus motioned for her to follow him. He led her toward the side terrace, one of the only places in the mansion untouched by Edward's rigid presence. Outside, the night was cool. A breeze rustled through the hedges. The moonlight softened the world, making everything gentler. "I like talking to you," Marcus said, leaning against the railing. Elena turned to face him, the moon casting a pale glow on her cheekbones, the curve of her jaw. "And I like that you don't let him intimidate you. I like your eyes, they're very fierce. And I like your hair, it's bold. I like you, Elena," he said, lifting his hands to touch her face. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he took a step closer. They were close now, too close. Her breath hitched slightly as he reached out, fingers brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Elena couldn't deny how much he had grown on her these past few weeks. She stayed silent, looking into his eyes as the winds made the leaves rustle and crickets chirp. And then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned in and kissed her passionately. Elena didn't resist. Instead, she melted into his arms. Then, like a sudden volcano eruption, Edward's voice cut through the moment like a blade. They both turned sharply. He stood in the doorway, his face a storm cloud of fury and disbelief. No drink in hand this time, just rage. "You're fraternizing with the help?" He barked at Marcus, stepping outside. "Is this what you've become? Seduced by a brown-skinned girl who doesn't know her place?" Elena's breath caught. Her spine stiffened, but she said nothing. Marcus stepped forward. "Don't talk to her like that." Edward's eyes burned with fury. "You're Langston. You don't drag our name through the dirt for a fling with a maid." "A maid, Marcus. She has a name. Her name is Elena." Marcus screamed at his father. "I don't care what her name is." Edward shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "This is exactly why your mother gave up trying. You shame everything this family built." Marcus's fists clenched. "Then maybe it's time to tear it down." With that, he turned and stormed back into the house. Elena lingered for half a breath, her head suddenly aching, her eyes shifting. She froze for a second before turning to follow Marcus, but stopped. Edward stood there, chest rising unevenly, his hand pressed against the side of his ribs. She took a step forward. "Mr. Langston?" He didn't answer. Then his knees buckled. "Mr. Langston!" He collapsed onto the stone patio with a heavy thud. Elena rushed to his side, panic clawing at her throat. She remembered that Marcus had mentioned that he was suffering from a heart condition, which he had kept a secret from everyone. "Where are your meds?" she muttered, patting his pockets. "Nothing." She looked up at the house, then back down. "Stay with me." She ran inside and screamed Marcus's name, but he wasn't answering. Startled by her screams, some staff came outside, but it didn't seem they knew what to do. So, she ignored them and sprinted into the study. She rummaged through everything, the cabinets, the drawers, nothing. Then she remembered Ruth once mentioning something about the second-floor bathroom, the locked cabinet. She ran up the stairs, picked the lock with a hairpin she yanked from her bun, and found a bottle of nitroglycerin tablets shoved behind shaving cream. She ran back down the stairs, back out the door. Her lungs burned, but she dropped to her knees beside him. "Open your mouth," she begged. By this time, the whole house was startled. Marcus was at the door, but was too scared to move or come close to his father. Edward's lips barely parted. She slipped the tablet under his tongue and tilted his head gently. Come on," she said faintly, scared. Minutes passed like hours. Then his breathing steadied just slightly. His eyes fluttered open, confused, then focused on her. She didn't say anything, just sat there, shaking and furious and afraid. Because, despite everything, she had saved him. And he knew it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elena sat on the floor beside Edward, her hand still trembling slightly as she wiped the sweat from his forehead. Edward's gaze flickered to her, his breath still labored. There was something raw in his eyes, something he rarely showed, vulnerability and maybe a hint of gratitude. But before he could speak, Marcus's voice cracked from the doorway. "Dad, are you okay?" Edward didn't respond immediately. His lips parted as if to speak, but he swallowed hard, the weight of what had just happened settling over him. His gaze shifted from Marcus to Elena, the fury that had once lived there, now replaced with regret. He blinked slowly, taking a deep breath. The self-righteous, superior man who thought everyone beneath him was deserving only of disdain wasn't here anymore. Edward's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the side of the bed, but it wasn't to push himself up. It was to steady himself in the face of what he now realized. Elena had saved him, despite everything he had thrown at her. And in that moment, the truth hit him with the force of a hurricane. He had been wrong and cruel, and worse. He had pushed away the very people who had the potential to change his life for the better because of his shallowness. A long silence followed, and he spoke, his voice softer than she'd ever heard. "I didn't ask for your help," he said quietly, his tone lacking the usual venom. Elena stood up slowly. Her voice was steady, but tinged with something close to exhaustion. "Sometimes you don't get a choice," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his, as if daring him to look away. Elena turned to walk away, but she couldn't shake the feeling that, in saving him, she had begun a process in both of them. She wasn't sure what it meant for her or Marcus. But for Edward, he was no longer just a man who had treated her like dirt. He was something else, someone who might just be learning to see the world beyond his rigid boundaries. As she walked past Marcus, who was still standing there, she gave him a single, almost imperceptible glance. It was enough to tell him that she was still here despite everything. Still present. Still determined. Edward could do nothing but sit there, watching her leave, his chest heavy with the weight of the moment. His mind replayed everything, all the times he had been cruel, all the walls he had built around himself. He had been so blinded by his wealth, status, and pride that he had failed to see the truth staring him in the face. Without Elena, he would have been lying there, a man brought to the brink, left to fend for himself. He could have died in that moment, lost in ignorance, but Elena had saved him. She had chosen to do what was right, even when he hadn't. He felt the sting of that realization like a slap. The man who had seen others as beneath him and judged them without understanding now found himself questioning everything. Had he really believed his money and power made him untouchable? The truth was that he had been more fragile than he'd ever realized. It wasn't the power that held him up. It was the people who cared, who saw past his money, fame, and the color of his skin. If this story gave you chills or made you think twice about judging people by appearances, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one.